I heard the judge's bar ring 3 times, and I could now see the tarns coming forth. There was a cry of expectancy from the crowd. Last-minute bets were being placed. Cushions were being rearranged. 8 tarns were flying in this race, and, hooded, they were brought forth on low, sideless, wheeled platforms, drawn by horned Thalarion. The carts were painted in faction colours. The rider rode on the carts beside his bird, dressed in the silk of his faction. The tarns were, of course, racing tarns, a bird in many ways quite different from the common tarns of Gore or the war tarns. The differences among these tarns are not simply in the training, which does differ, but in the size, strength, build, and tendencies of the bird. Some tarns are bred primarily for strength, and are used in transporting wares by carrying basket. Usually these birds fly more slowly and are less vicious than the war tarns or racing tarns. The war tarns, of course, are bred for both strength and speed, but also for agility, swiftness of reflex, and combative instincts. War tarns, whose talons are shod with steel, tend to be extremely dangerous birds, even more so than the other tarns, and none of whom could be regarded as fully domesticated. The racing tarn, interestingly, has an extremely light build. 2 men can lift one. Even its beak is narrower and lighter than the beak of a common tarn or war tarn. Its wings are commonly broader and shorter than those of the other tarns, which permit a swifter take-off and providing a capacity for extremely abrupt turns and shifts in flight. They cannot carry a great deal of weight, and the riders, as might be expected, are small men, usually of low caste, pugnacious and aggressive. Racing tarns are not used by tarnsmen in war, because they lack the weight and power of the war tarns. Meeting a war tarn in flight, a racing tarn would be torn to pieces in moments. Further, the racing tarns, though marvellous in their particular ways, lack the stamina of the common tarn or the war tarn. Their short wings, after a flight of perhaps only 50 parsangs, would begin to fail. In a short distance dash, of course, the racing tarn would commonly be superior to the war tarn. The tarns were now being unhooded, and they leapt up, with a snap of their wings, to their perches, numbered and chosen by lot. Possession of the inside perch is regarded, of course, as an advantage. I noted that Green had the inside perch this race. This would swing some silver to Green surely, for men, though they have their factions, yet will purchase the tiles of the bird they feel has the best chance of winning. The same perches that are used in starting the race, incidentally, are the perches which the tarns will take after the race. The winning perch, or the first perch after the race, is that closest to the stands, rather than that closest to the dividing wall, the inside perch, which is first with respect to the beginning of the race, and most desirable at the beginning, least desirable at the end. I noted that 2 of the tarns in this race were not of given factions, but were the property of private owners, not associated with the faction corporations. Their riders, similarly, were not faction riders. The rider, incidentally, is quite as important as the bird, for an experienced rider often manages to bring a new bird to the first perch, whereas even a fine bird, controlled poorly or timidly, is likely to be far outdone. "Candies!" whined a small voice some yards below me. "Candies!" I looked down and was startled to see, from some 4 tiers below, not seeing me, the pathetic, stubby, bulbous little body of Hup the Fool, limping and hopping about the aisle, his large head on the fat little body, lolling one way or another, the tongue occasionally, suddenly, unexpectedly protruding uncontrollably. His knobby hands were clutching a candy tray, which was fastened behind his neck with a strap. "Candies!" he whined. "Candies!" Many of the people he passed turned away. The 3 women drew their hoods around their faces. Some of the men angrily gestured for the little fool to hurry from their area, lest he spoil the racers for their women. I did note that a young slave girl, however, perhaps 15, with a coin given her by her master, did purchase a small candy from the little Hup. I might have brought some myself, but I did not wish him to recognize me, assuming that his simple mind might hold the remembrance of our first meeting, that at the tavern of Spindius, where I had saved his life. "Candies!" cried the little fellow. "Candies!" I supposed Hup, though he doubtless spent much of his time begging, made what money he could, and vending candies at the races might help him to live. I wondered if the golden tarn disc, that of Porter's, which I had given to him at the tavern, had been used to buy a vending license. "I think I shall have a candy," said the man behind me. I arose and turned away, leaving my place on the tier, that I might not be seen by Hup should he approach the man. I looked neither to the left or right, but moved away. "Candy!" called the man behind me. "Yes, master," I heard Hup call, and began to make his way toward the man. I found a seat several yards away, and after a bit noted Hup making his way down another aisle in the opposite direction. "What's your faction?" asked the man whom I had sat down beside, a metal worker. "Oh, I favour the Greens," I said, saying the first thing came into my mind. "Ah, I'm gold myself," he said. He wore a patch of golden cloth on his left shoulder. The judge's bar rang once, and there was a cry from the crowd, and all leapt to their feet, as with a flurry of beating wings, almost at the instant the white cord was whipped away from in front of them, the tarns took flight. The Green, which had had the inside perch, took the lead. The track flown by the tarns is 1 parsang in length. In English measure, the two sides of the track are each about 1,700 feet in length, and the measure at the corners would be something under 150 in width. The flight track itself, of course, is rather like a narrow aerial rectangle with 2 rounded ends. The course is determined by 12 rings, hung on chains from great supporting towers. 6 of these rings are rectangular, and 6 are round. The large rectangular rings are 3 on a side. The smaller round rings are set at the corners of the dividing wall, and 1 at each of the narrowest portions of the dividing wall. Thus, in leaving the perches at the beginning of the race, the tarns pass first through the 3 rectangular rings, and then come to the first turn, where they negotiate 3 round rings, 2 of which are at the corners, and then they encounter 3 more rectangular rings, and then come to the second turn, where they again encounter 3 round rings, 2 at the corner and 1 in the centre. Skill is required in flying such a course, particularly in making the turns and passing through the small round rings. If 4 tarns were flown perfectly, 1 above, 1 below, and 1 on each side, 4 could just pass through 1 of the round rings. One of the objects, of course, is to manoeuvre the tarn in such a way that it takes the centre of the ring, or forces the following bird to strike the ring or miss it altogether. I doubt that this fierce form of racing would be practical were it not for the almost uncanny agility in flight of the short-winged racing tarns. This race was a short one, only 5 parsangs in length, and one of the non-faction birds won, much to the displeasure of the crowd, saving those who had dared to accept the long odds on such a bird. One man near me had apparently been one of the lucky few, for he was leaping up and down screaming with delight. And then, stumbling and brushing through spectators, a few of whom shared his pleasure, he was making his way down to the table of the odds of merchants. I noted that Minas Tentius Cinrabius now chose to leave the races. He did so, irritation in his every movement, followed by his guard, Sophronicus, the captain of the guards, and the rest of his retinue. To my surprise, hardly anyone in the stands even noted his going. There were various races to follow, but the afternoon sun was now below the roof of the central cylinder in the distance, and I decided to leave the races. As I did so, I passed several girls kneeling on the stone tier, slave girls. They were doubtless girls in training, and reasonably well advanced in training. They had been brought to see the races, that they might be pleased and stimulated, that they might return to their training refreshed and recreated. They were clearly enjoying themselves, and some were making bets, the stakes being pleasure beads from the contents of the jewellery and cosmetic box allotted to each, usually kept in her cell. They were fastened together by wrist to wrist by slave bracelets. At each end of the time there was a guard. The slaves wore light hooded cloaks, the length of which, when they stood, would fall slightly above the hem of their brief slave livery. The garments had rather large sleeves, and fastened with a cord under the chin. It protected them from the sun to some extent, but even more from the glances of the curious. Some of the girls, judging by the stripes on the hoods and cloaks, were white silk, others red silk. The white silk girls, of course, having been released from the house, would have been placed in locked iron belts. The girls were neither of the house of Kernus nor of Porters, but one of the several lesser houses on the street of Brands. I heard the judge's bar ring twice, informing the crowd that the next ring would begin in 10 ain. I rose from my seat and began to make my way to the exit. Some of the spectators looked at me with ill-concealed reproach, even something amounting to disdain. The racing fan of R commonly remains till the last race, and sometimes even later, discussing the races and commenting on how he would have flown such and such a race better than the bird's rider. I didn't even wear a faction patch. It was my intention to relax at the Carpathian Baths, have a leisurely supper at some Parga tavern, and then return to the house of Kernus. There was a little wench named Naila, usually in the pool of blue flowers, whom I enjoyed sporting with. By the time I returned to the house of Kernus, Elizabeth would have finished her slave porridge, and be in the compartment, and I would hear about her day, and she would hear about mine, or most of it. When she was permitted later in her training to leave the house more often, I was eager to take her to the races and the baths, though perhaps not to the pool of blue flowers. Chapter 12. The Peasant. The shrill pain scream of the Rancino Tarn pierced the roar of the frenzied crowd. "Blue! Blue!" screamed the man next to me, a blue patch sewn on his left shoulder, a pair of glazed blue clay plates clutched in his right hand. The Tarn, screaming, its wing useless, tumbled uncontrollably from the edge of the large open padded ring suspended over the net on the track, plunging into the net, its rider cutting the safety straps and leaping from its back in order that he not be slain beneath the bird struggling in the net. The other bird, which had buffeted against the edge of the ring, spun awkwardly through, turned in the air, and under the savage command of its control straps, it responded to a yellow flash of the Tarn goad, and regained its control and sped toward the next ring. "Red! Red! Red!" I heard from nearby. The next 7 Tarns, strung out, sped through the ring and wheeled in flight to take the next ring. Their leader was a brown racing Tarn, whose rider wore red silk, and whose small saddle and tight control straps were of red leather. This was only the 3rd lap in a 10-lap race, and yet already 2 Tarns were down in the net. I could see the netmen expertly moving across the broad strands, approaching them, looping in their hands to tie together the bird's beak, to bind its curved wicked talons. The wing one bird was apparently broken, for the netman, after binding it, quickly cut its throat. the blood falling through the net, staining it, soaking into the sand below in a brownish-red patch. Its rider took the saddle and control straps from the still quivering bird, and dropped with them through the broad strands of the net to the sand some 6 feet below. The other bird was apparently only stunned, and it was being rolled to the edge of the net, where it would be dropped into a large wheeled frame, drawn by 2 horned thalarian onto a suspended canvas, where it was immediately secured by broad canvas straps. "Gold! Gold!" cried a man 2 tiers away from me. Already the birds had turned the 12-ringed track, and were again approaching. A bird of the yellow faction was in the lead, followed by red, then blue, gold, orange, green, and silver. In the crowd I heard the shrill screams of slave girls and free women alike, the difference between them lost in the moment of their excitement. During the time of the race, the hawkers of candies, sweetmeats, kalanar, pastries, and parga were quiet, standing with their goods in the aisles, watching. And many of them, too, were much involved in the race, for concealed in their trays or about their persons were doubtless the glazed clay tablets purchased from the track merchants, redeemable at odds should their favourites finish in one of the 4 privileged positions. The birds swept past us again. "O priest kings!" cried a man near by, a leather worker, "speed the wings of red!" Every one in the crowd seemed to be on their feet, even those who sat in the marble tiers beneath the awnings of purple silk. I rose also that I might see. Near the finishing perches, 9 of which were standing for this race, were the areas reserved for the administrator, the high initiate, and the members of the high council. These areas were almost porches, extending beyond the regular stands. They were covered with awnings, on which were mounted sets of curule chairs at different levels. Flanked by 2 guards in the red of warriors, I could see the throne of the administrator, on which, intent, leaning forward, sat the members of the Hinarabian family, who now stood highest in Ar. Near by, but lofty, as though disinterested, on a throne of white marble, but between 2 warriors as well, sat the high initiate. Before him sat 2 rows of initiates, who were intoning prayers to the priest-kings, not watching the race. I noted that a green banner hung over the wall, both before the thrones of the administrator and the high initiate, indicating they favoured the greens. The warriors who flanked the administrator and the high initiate, incidentally, were Torrentians, members of the palace guard, an elite corps of swordsmen and bowmen, carefully selected, specially trained, independent of the general military organizations of the city. Their leader or captain was Saphronicus, a mercenary from Tyrus. I could see him a few feet behind the throne, wrapped in a scarlet cloak, a tall, spare man, long-armed and narrow-faced, whose head moved restlessly, surveying the crowd. There were other favoured areas, too, about the sands in the front, each covered by awnings, in which there sat members of the numerous high families of the city. I noted that some of these areas were now occupied by merchants. I had no objection to this, for I have always thought higher of the merchants than many of my caste, but I was surprised. In the time of Marlenus, when he was Uberavar, I think even his friend Mintar, that great brilliant toad of a man, of the caste of merchants, would not have had so choice a vantage point from which to observe the races. Across the track on the far side I heard a judge's bar clanging, indicating that one of the birds had missed a ring, and a coloured disc, silver, was hauled to the top of a pole. There was a groan from many in the crowd, and others cried out with delight. The rider was wheeling the bird, trying to bring it under control, and returning to the ring. By this time the other birds had flashed through it. Below me I saw a hawker of sweetmeats angrily discarding 4 silver-glazed numbered tiles. The birds were now flashing through the great rings before me. Yellow held the lead, followed by red. Green had now moved up to third. "Green! Green!" a woman was crying out not far from me, her veil awry, her fists clenched. The administrator leant forward even more on his throne. He was said to wager heavily on the races. On the low stone wall, some 7 or 8 feet in height, some 40 feet in width, which divided the track, I could see that only 3 of the great wooden tarn heads remained on their poles, indicating that only 3 laps remained in the race. In a few moments, with a cry of victory, the rider of the yellow brought his tarn to the first perch, followed closely by the red and the green. And then, one after another, gold, blue, orange, and silver took their perches. The last 2 perches remained empty. I looked to the arena of the administrator, and saw the Henrabian disgustedly turning away, dictating something to a scribe, who sat cross-legged near the throne, a sheaf of record papers in his hand. The high initiate had risen to his feet, and accepted a goblet from another initiate, probably containing minced-flavoured ices, for the afternoon was warm. The crowd now engaged in various pursuits, no fixed centre now holding their attention. Several were going about seeking the odds, merchants, several of whom wandered in the stands, but others of whom kept their tables at the foot of the stands, on the sand itself, almost under the nets beneath the rings. The hawkers of candies and such were now crying their wares. I heard a slave girl wheedling her master for a pastry. Free women here and there were delicately putting titbits beneath their veils. Some even lifted their veils somewhat to drink of the flavoured ices. Some low-caste free women drank through their veils, and there were yellow and purple stains on the rep-cloth. I heard the judge's bar sound twice, indicating that the next race would begin in 10 ain. There was some scurrying about to find the odds merchants. Almost everyone in the crowd wore some indication of the faction he favoured. Generally it was a small faction patch sewn on the left shoulder. The faction patches of the high-caste women tended to be fine silk and tastefully done. Those of low-caste women merely a square of crudely stitched, dyed rep-cloth. Some of the masters had dressed their slave girls in slave livery in the colours of their factions. Others had twined a coloured ribbon about their hair or collar. "The races were better in the days of Marlenus of Ar," said a man behind me, leaning forward to speak to me. I shrugged. I didn't find it strange that he had spoken to me. When I had left the house of Kerners, I had removed the livery of the black caste, and had washed the sign of the dagger from my forehead. I wore a worn red tunic, that of a warrior. It was thus easier for me to move about the city. I would not be likely to be noticed or feared. Men would be more willing to speak to me. "But," said the man glumly, "what can you expect with a Henrabian on the throne of the Ubar?" "On the throne of the administrator," I said, not turning around. "There is only one who is first in Ar," said the man. "Marlenus, who was Ubar of Ar. He, the Ubar of Ubars." "I would not speak so," I said. "There are those around who may not care to hear such words." I heard the man make a noise of amusement and lean back. Marlenus, who had been Ubar of Ar many years ago, had founded the empire of Ar, and had extended the hegemony of luxurious Ar over several cities of the north. He had fallen when I had purloined the home stone of the city. Later, he had helped to free Ar after it had fallen to the horde of Parker, master of assassins, who had wished to become Ubar of the city. inheriting the medallion of office and putting about his shoulder the purple cloak of the empire. Marlenus, because he had lost the home stone, and because the men of Ar feared him and his ambitions, had been publicly denied bread, salt, and fire, exiled from the city, and forbidden to return on pain of death. He had become an outlaw in the Voltae, whence he could see, with loyal followers, the spires of Ar, glorious Ar, where once he had ruled as Ubar. I knew that there were many in who did not wish for the exiled of Marlenus, particularly the lower castes, which he had always championed. Khazrak, who had been administrator of the city for several years, had been popular, but his straightforward attention, after he had put aside the red of the warrior and donned the brown of the administrator, to numerous and complex civil and economic matters, such as the reform of the courts and laws and controls and regulations pertaining to commerce, had not been such to inspire the general enthusiasm of the common citizens of Ar. In particular, he could not inspire those who remembered with nostalgia the glories and splendours of the reign of Marlenus, that Lal of a man, that magnificent warrior, vain and self-centred, powerful, conceited, and yet a dreamer of dreams, of a world undivided and safe for men, a world united, be it at the point of the swords of Ar. I remembered Marlenus. He had been such that, standing before men and lifting his hand, 1,000 swords would be unsheathed in the sun, 1,000 throats would cry his name, 1,000 men would march, or 1,000 tarns would fly. Such a man needed to be exiled from Ar. Such a man could never be second in a city. I heard the judge's bar ring 3 times, and I could now see the tarns coming forth. There was a cry of expectancy from the crowd. Last-minute bets were being placed. Cushions were being arranged. It was now some 20 days after the girls had been brought in from the Voltae, yet Elizabeth and the 2 others, Virginia and Phyllis, had only been in training for 5 days. This had to do with certain decisions of Flaminius and O2, and the 2 girls, Virginia and Phyllis. I myself had been there that night that both, interrogated in their cages, had agreed to train as slave girls. I would have expected their training to have begun immediately, but it had not. For about 15 days, while the other captive earth girls had been removed to an iron pen, Virginia and Phyllis remained in the tiny cement iron-gated cages, so constructed that the inmate cannot at any one time fully stretch her body. Over a period of time this builds up a considerable amount of body pain, and Phyllis, on the instructions of Flaminius, was further tormented in being braceleted to the bars for several arn a day, as she had been the first night, being fed her gruel by hand, taking her water from a tin bottle thrust between her lips. At last, even Phyllis had asked again and again if they were to be trained. Irrationally asked, for the guard couldn't even understand English. This question, insistently and irrationally pressed, received no answer. The guard, under instructions, did not even address a word in Gorean to them. In so far as was possible, he ignored them. They were fed and watered as animals, which in Gorean eyes, being slaves, they were. Flaminius would not visit them. For days they remained in their cages, cramped and miserable, alone, neglected, apparently overlooked, forgotten. They came to look eagerly for the sound of the bolt on the door. At last Flaminius visited them, informing them that they were not to be trained, and he left. Both at this point became hysterical. The next day Flaminius re-entered the chamber, but apparently only to pick up some records which he had left behind the day before. Piteously, hysterically, they had cried out to him, begging to be taken from the cages, begging to be trained. Flaminius, apparently moved by their entreaties, told them that he would speak to Cernus, master of the house, and to Ho Tu, master keeper. He didn't return until late the next day, when the girls, with tears of relief, heard that Cernus, who was moved to kindness, would permit them an opportunity to train. They were sternly warned, however, that if their training did not proceed well, they would be promptly returned to the kennels. Flaminius then accepted their tearful gratitude for his intercession on their behalf. Since Elizabeth was to be the lead girl in the set, she was summoned to the kennel chamber when Virginia and Phyllis were to be released. I accompanied her. When the small iron gates were raised, the guard with a whip standing over them, Virginia and Phyllis crawled painfully out onto the iron walkway. They couldn't stand. The guard braceleted one of Phyllis's wrists to the rail, and then snapped bracelets on Virginia, confining her wrists behind her back. He carried Virginia down to the main level and set her on her knees there, in front of Flaminius and Ho Tu. Elizabeth and I were in the background. Then the guard went back up the walkway, freed Phyllis only to bracelet her hands behind her back, as he had done with Virginia, and then he carried her, too, down the iron stairs, and placed her beside Virginia. He shoved the heads of both of them to the stones of the floor. "Is the iron ready?" asked Ho Tu of the guard, and the man nodded. At a signal from Ho Tu, the guard carried Virginia to the branding rack and placed her in the rack, spinning the lever that locked them, wrists braceleted behind her back, locked in place, watching the approach of the iron, observing the graceful white-hot character at the iron's termination. She screamed uncontrollably when the iron marked her, firmly, decisively, for about 3 een, and then she sobbed, beside herself, while the guard spun the lever, releasing her. He lifted her from the rack and put her on the stones at the feet of Ho Tu and Flaminius. Phyllis's eyes were wild with fear, but she, like Virginia, didn't so much as whimper as the guard lifted her, carried her to the rack, and locked her in place. "We still do hand branding," said Ho Tu to me. "Mechanical devices brand too uniformly. Buyers like a hand-branded girl. Besides, it is better for a female slave to be branded by a man. It makes them better slaves. The rack, however, is a useful device, preventing a blurred brand." He indicated the guard. "Striers," he said, "has one of the finest irons in R. His work is almost always exact and clean." Phyllis Robertson threw back her head and screamed helplessly, and then she too began to sob, trembling, when the guard Strius released her from the rack and put her with Virginia. Both girls were weeping. Flaminius gently stretched out their legs and rubbed them. I am sure in the pain of branding they scarcely felt the pain which might be attendant on his massage, trying to restore some feeling and strength to their aching limbs. I heard a woman move close to me, heard the sound of slave bells. I looked to one side and was startled. Watching us was a woman in pleasure silk of remarkable beauty, yet with a certain subtle hardness and contempt about her. She wore a yellow collar, that of the house of Cernus, and yellow pleasure silk. The slave bells, a double row, were locked on her left ankle. Around her throat there hung a slave whistle. From her right hand, looped about the wrist, there dangled a slave goad. She was fairly complexioned, but had extremely dark hair and dark eyes, and very red lips. The movement of her exquisite body was a torment to observe. As she looked at me with a slight smile, regarding the black tunic, the mark of the dagger. Her lips were full and magnificently turned, probably a characteristic bred into her. I had no doubt this black-haired, cruelly beautiful woman was a bred passion-slave. She was one of the most rawly sensuous creatures on which I had ever looked. "I am Sura," she said, looking at me. "I teach girls to give pleasure to men." "These are the three," said Ho-Tu, indicating the two branded girls and Elizabeth. Flaminius rose to his feet, leaving the two girls lying on the stone, sobbing. "Kneel," said Sura to the girls in Korean. "Kneel," said Flaminius to them in English. The two girls, freshly branded, tears in their eyes, struggled to their knees. Sura walked round them, and then she regarded Elizabeth. "Take off your clothes," she said. Elizabeth did so, drawing at the loop on the left shoulder of her garment. "Join them," ordered Sura, and Elizabeth went to kneel between Virginia and Phyllis. "Bracelet her," said Sura, and the guard snapped slave bracelets on Elizabeth, confining her hands behind her back like the other girls. "You are lead girl?" asked Sura of Elizabeth. "Yes," said Elizabeth. Sura's finger flicked the slave goad on. She rotated the dial. The tip began to glow a bright yellow. "Yes, mistress," said Elizabeth. "You are barbarian?" asked Sura. "Yes, mistress," said Elizabeth. Sura spat on the stones before Elizabeth. "And they are all barbarians," said Ho-Tu. Sura turned round and looked at him with disgust. "How does Canis expect me to train barbarians?" she asked. Ho-Tu shrugged. "Do what you can," said Flaminius. "These are intelligent slaves. They all have promise." "You know nothing of such matters," said Sura. Flaminius looked down, angry. Sura walked over to the girls, lifted Virginia's head and looked into her eyes, and then stepped back. "Her face is too thin, and there are blemishes, and she is thin, too thin." Ho-Tu shrugged. Sura looked at Elizabeth. "This one," she said, "was Tuchu. She will know nothing except the care of Bosc and the cleaning of leather." Elizabeth wisely refrained from response. "Now this one," said Sura, examining Phyllis, "has a slave's body, but how does she move? I have seen these barbarians. They cannot even stand straight. They cannot even walk." "Do what you can," said Flaminius. "It is hopeless," said Sura, stepping back to us. "Nothing can be done for them. Sell them all for a minor block and be done with it. They are cattle girls, only that." Sura dialed the slave goad down and then switched it off. "Sura," said Flaminius. "Kettle girls," snapped Sura. Ho-Tu shook his head. "Sura is right," he said rather too agreeably. "They are only kettle girls." "Oh, but," protested Flaminius. "Kettle girls," insisted Ho-Tu, and Sura laughed in triumph. "No one could do anything with such barbarians," said Ho-Tu to Flaminius. "Not even Sura." Something about the back of Sura's neck informed me she had noted what Ho-Tu had said and hadn't cared for the sound of it. I saw Ho-Tu grimace at Flaminius. A smile broke out on the physician's face. "You're right," he said. "No one could do anything with such barbarians. They could not be trained by anyone, except perhaps Tethrite of the House of Porters." "Oh, I had forgotten about her," said Ho-Tu.
"Tethrite is an ignorant she-Thalarian," said Sura irritably.
"Oh, she is the best trainer in Ar," said Ho-Tu.
"I, Sura, am the best in Ar," said the girl, not pleasantly.
"Of course," said Ho-Tu to Sura.
Besides, said Flaminius to Ho-Tu, even Tephrighti of the House of Porters could not train such barbarians.
Sura was now inspecting the girls more closely. She had pushed one thumb under Virginia's head.
"Do not be frightened, little bird," said Sura soothingly in Gorean to Virginia.
Sura removed her thumb, and Virginia kept her fine head on its delicate neck high.
Some men might like a thin, pocked face, said Sura. And her eyes are grey. That is very good.
Sura looked at Elizabeth.
You are probably the stupid one, she said. I scarcely think so, said Elizabeth, adding acidly, Mistress? Oh, good, said Sura to herself, good. And you, she said to Phyllis, you with the body of a passion slave, what of you?
Sura then took the slave goad, which was off, and moved it along the left side of Phyllis's body, touching her with the cold metal. Instinctively, even in her pain from the branding and with her aching limbs, Phyllis made a small noise and pulled away from the cold metal. The movement of her shoulders and belly was noted by Sura. She stood up, and again the slave goad dangled from her right wrist. She indicated Virginia and Phyllis.
How do you expect me to train uncollared slaves? She asked.
Ho-Tu grinned. Call the smith, he said to the guard. Plate collars. To their surprise, the guard then released the two girls, and Elizabeth as well, from their slave bracelets. Flaminius gestured that the two girls should try to rise and walk a bit around the room. Awkwardly, painfully, they did so, stumbling to the edge of the room, and then leaning against the wall, taking a step at a time. Elizabeth, now also free, went to their side, trying to help them. She didn't speak to them, however. As far as they knew, she could speak only Gorean. When the smith arrived, he took from the rack in the wall 2 narrow straight bars of iron, not really plates, but narrow cubes, about half an inch in width and 15 inches in length. The girls were then motioned to the anvil. First Virginia and then Phyllis laid their heads and throats on the anvil, head to one side, their hands holding the anvil. And the smith, expertly, with his heavy hammer and a ringing of iron, curved the collar around their throats. A space of about 1/4 of an inch was left between the two ends of the collar. The ends matched perfectly. Both Virginia and Phyllis stepped away from the anvil, feeling the metal on their throats, both now collared slave girls.
If your training goes well, said Flaminius to the girls, you will in time be given a pretty collar.
He indicated Elizabeth's yellow enamelled collar, bearing the legend of the House of Cernus.
It will even have a lock, said Flaminius.
Virginia looked at him blankly.
You would like a pretty collar, wouldn't you? Asked Flaminius. Yes, master, said Virginia numbly. And what of you, Phyllis? Asked Flaminius. Yes, master, said the girl, a whisper. I will decide if and when they receive a lock collar, said Sura. Oh, of course, said Flaminius, backing away with a step, bowing his head. Kneel, said Sura, pointing to the stones before her feet. This time Virginia and Phyllis needed no translation, and they, with Elizabeth, knelt before Sura. Sura turned to Ho-Tu. The Tuchuk girl, she said, keeps quarters with the assassin. I do not object. Take the others to cells of red silk.
Oh, they are white silk, said Ho-Tu. Sura laughed.
Oh, very well. To cells of white silk. Feed them well. You have almost crippled them. How you expect me to train crippled barbarians, I'm not clear.
You will do splendidly, said Flaminius warmly. Sura glared at him coldly, and the physician dropped his eyes.
In the first week, she said, I will also need one who speaks their tongue. Further, when not training, they must learn Korean, and quickly. I will send one who speaks their tongue, said Flaminius. Also, I will arrange that they are taught Korean. Translate for me,
said Sura to Flaminius as she turned and faced the 3 kneeling girls. She then spoke to them in short sentences, pausing for Flaminius to translate. "I am Sura. I will train you. In the hours of training you are my slaves. You will do what I wish. You will work. You will work and you will learn. You will be pleasing. I will teach. You will work and you will learn." Then she looked at them. "Fear me," she said. Flaminius translated this as well, and then without speaking she flicked on the slave goad and rotated the dial. The tip began to glow brightly. Then suddenly she struck at the 3 kneeling girls. The charge must have been high, judging by the intense shower of fiery yellow needles of light and the screams of pain from the 3 girls. Again and again Sura struck, and the girls, half stunned, half crazed with pain, seemed unable to even move, but they could only scream and cry. Even Elizabeth, whom I knew was swift and spirited, seemed paralyzed and tortured by the goad. And then Sura dialed the goad down and turned it off. The 3 girls, lying in pain on the stones, looked up at her in fear, even the proud Elizabeth, their bodies trembling, their eyes wide. I read in their eyes, even those of Elizabeth, a sudden terror of the goad. "Fear me," said Sura softly, Flaminius translated. And then Sura turned to Flaminius. "Have them sent to my training room at the 6th Arn," she said, and turned and walked away, the slave bells flashing on her ankle. I left the tiers of the racing stadium and began to walk down the long, sloping stone ramp level by level. There were few leaving the races, but I did pass some late-comers moving up the ramps who had perhaps been detained or had been released from their shops only late in the day. At one corner in the descending ramp there was a small knot of young men, weavers by their garments, who were gambling with the inked knuckle-bones of Ver, shaking them in a small leather cup and spilling them onto the stones. On the ground level, beneath the lofty stands, there was much more life. Here there were lines of booths in an extended arcade, with merchandise of various sorts, usually of an inexpensive and low-quality variety. There were poorly woven small tapestries, amulets and talismans, knotted prayer strings, papers containing praises of priest-kings which might be carried on one's person, and numerous ornaments of glass and cheap metal, the strung pearls of the Voskhorn, polished shelly brooches, pins with heads carved from the horn of Cailleach tridents, lucky sleen teeth, racks of rep-cloth robes, veils, tunics in various cast collars, cheap knives and belts and pouches, vials containing perfumes for which extraordinary claims were made, and small clay painted replicas of the stadium and racing tarns. I also saw a booth where sandals were sold, cheaply and poorly sewn, which the seller was proclaiming were of the same sort as those worn by Menicius of Port Car. He, riding yellow, had won one of the races I had just witnessed. He claimed over 6,000 wins, and was in our, and certainly of the northern cities generally, a quite popular hero. He was said in private to be cruel and dissolute, venal and petty, but when he climbed into the saddle of a racing tarn, there were few who did not thrill to the sight. It was said that no man could ride as Menicius of Port Car. The sandals, I noted, were selling quite well. I was approached twice by men who had small scrolls to sell, reputedly containing important information on forthcoming races, the tarns to be flown, the riders, their times recorded in previous races and such. I suppose this would be little more than what was publicly available on the large track boards, and was copied from them. On the other hand, such men always claim to have important information not contained on the public boards. I knew that when there was such information, it would not be to such men that it would be known. "I am lonely," said a kneeling slave girl by one of the booths, lifting her hand to me. I looked at her, a comely wench in soiled pleasure silk. She was leashed, and her master, who wished to rent her for 1/4 of an arn, held the chain with its leather loop wound in his fist.
"You, sir," he said, "the poor wench is lonely. Only a copper tarn disc."
I turned, and pressing through the crowd, walked away. As I was passing under the main arch of the stadium, going to the broad street beyond, called the Street of Tarns because of its proximity to the stadium, I heard a voice behind me.
"Perhaps you did not enjoy the races."
It was the voice of the man who had sat behind me in the tiers, before I had changed my seat to avoid recognition by the small fool Hupp, he who had spoken poorly of an Arabian on the throne of Ar, and who had purchased a candy from the fool. It struck me there was something familiar about the voice. I turned. Facing me, clean-shaven, but with a massive regal face concealed in the hood of a peasant, his gigantic body broad and powerful in the coarse rep-cloth garment of what is thought to be Gore's lowest caste, there stood a man whom I could not mistake, even though it had been years since I had looked upon him, even though his great beard was now gone, even though his body now wore the hood and garment of a peasant. In his right hand there was a heavy peasant staff, some 6 feet in height and perhaps 2 inches in width. The man smiled at me and turned away. I reached out and began to walk after him, but I stumbled into the body of Hupp the Fool, spilling his tray of candies. "Oh, oh, oh!" cried the fool in misery. Angrily I tried to step around him, but then there were others pressing between myself and the large man in the peasant's garment, and he disappeared. I ran after him, but couldn't find him in the crowd. Hupp hobbled angrily after me, jerking at my tunic. "Pay! Pay!" he whined. I looked down at him, and I saw in those wide, simple eyes of uneven size no recognition. His poor mind could not even recall the face of the man who had saved his life. Irritably I gave him a silver 40 piece, far more than enough to pay for the spilled candies, and strode away. "Oh, thank you, master," whined the fool, leaping about from one foot to the other. Thank you, master." My mind was reeling. What did it mean, I asked myself, that he was in Ar? I strode away from the stadium, my mind confused, unsettled, breathing deeply, wildly. There had been no mistaking the man in the garments of a peasant, he with the great staff. I had seen Marlenus of Ar.